Hey everybody, my name is Tim, and today we're going to be looking at some material settings that are very important for getting the look you want in Fluid Flux 3. For this example, we're going to be looking at an ambience video that I made, which is set in a scene that's basically like a cozy cottage sitting by a creek. Creek is flowing nice and gently by it, and there's like a little garden and stuff. I had made another video on the basic simulation settings used in Fluid Flux 3 and how to set up the domain, things to think about for what it's going to see as a object to collide with. But outside of actually simulating the thing, there's a ton of settings that affect in a large way how the simulation and the water actually look. And those settings are found in the material. So today we're going to be talking about a bunch of those settings. Not all of them, but the ones that I've used to control the look. So here we go. So this right here is a duplicate of the scene that I used to render all the shots for my ambience video, minus almost all of the foliage. In the other scene, the real one, there was about 2.2 million instances of foliage and things, which just made the scene run really, really slow. So I removed those, but left the rocks, because we need the rocks in order to see what the water is doing. Even though we don't need to simulate anything today, it's just nice to see it, because if we don't see the rocks, it just looks kind of goofy. So we're going to leave those in here. One thing that I want to mention is when you simulate something, just by default, it has a certain material on it. It's like the default material. It doesn't look like this. So I'm going to put on that material. I'm going to show you what it looked like. First of all, if you watched my other video on how to set all this up, you'll know that we used the Flux surface river element right here. And that basically takes the place of any simulation. So this is just showing us what the simulation was. So we're going to click on that over here. And this is what it looks like at the top. We're going to scroll down to the section that says surface. And there's a bunch of different surfaces for different things. For example, in Fluid Flux, there are underwater materials. And there's like what this thing looks like underneath. And then there's the part that it looks like on the top. We're going to be worrying just about what it looks like on the top. So that is the surface over material. So you can see here, surface over baked, there's surface under material, there's post-processed materials. All we're going to worry about is the surface over material. So I've already got this still using the one that I've modified, but if we go over, let me make this a little bit bigger. Content, fluid flux, surface, templates, river, materials. That's where you find like the default materials that it uses for the river stuff, okay? And by default, you see here, river surface over. This is what it has on it by default. So we just drag this over to the slot. And this is how it looks. If you tried simulating fluid flux as a river, this is probably familiar to you. It looks very rapid, very foamy, and it doesn't really work for my scene. So I had to do a fair amount of adjustment to get it to look the way I wanted. I'm going to show you exactly what those settings are and what they do. So we're going to start with this, but one huge tip that you need to remember is do not modify this material directly. Make a copy of it, okay? So we're going to right click, duplicate, going to leave basically the same name. I'm just going to go underscore doot, because this is a tutorial. I like to save as often as I can because I've lost projects in the past. So we're going to take this one, which is the toot version, and drag that over so we don't mess up the original one. One reason why that's important is if you ever are in the midst, there's a lot of settings. There's dozens and dozens of settings. And it's easy to like be adjusting things and move things around, and you lose track of what's affecting what, and eventually you're like lost. And when you hit the reset to default button, it doesn't always go back to the original value for that thing in the river instance. So if you have the original river surface over material, you can refer back to it, you can start over, so don't change that one. All right, we're gonna open this thing up. All right, let me make this smaller. Okay, so these are all the settings. We have detail wave, fluid color, flux data, interaction, painter, state, surface layer, wave texture, and these all have a bunch of settings of their own. Foam, and then this is actually one that I made, which I'll show you in a second. So just a ton of settings, but I'm going to show you the ones that really affect how the water looks. I do have notes on my desk, so if I look down and I'm reading something, it's because there's a lot that I wanted to keep track of here. So we have essentially the default material here, and I'm going to go through and show you what everything does. Two main things you need to think about are this section called detail wave, and there's a checkbox here called use detail wave. If we come in here and look at this a little bit closer, and I turn off use detail wave, It's going to reload the shaders in a second. Okay, so all of the fine details of the waves and the little ripples are now gone. You can't really tell because there's foam. So if I scroll down and I go to the foam section and I go near the bottom and it says use foam and I uncheck that, this is now fully loaded. This is your simulation, okay? It looks like a laminar flow type thing where it's just this glassy this glassy surface with nothing going on. This is what you end up with when you export your simulation. It's got all of the subsurface scattering type things, it's got the reflection, the roughness, all that, but there's no other waves. It's just this. So hopefully they'll give you an idea of what the material adds to the detail of the simulation. It's incredibly important to work on this because without it, this is literally all it is. All right, so we're going to start back from the top and we're going to turn on use detail wave. And you see right away we have our wave ripples back and it looks like a real river. So we are going to start off by trying to adjust kind of the color of the water. Now, this is one thing that took me a long time to figure out, and it's possible I'm still doing it wrong, but there's a whole section here called fluid color. The vast majority of this stuff is actually not handled here. For the absorption, the scattering, the colors of things, there's actually, if you go back over here to the Flux surface river, scroll to the top, there's a tab here that you might miss, and I missed for a while, called Open Surface Editor tab. This is like a little widget that controls in a much more simplified way how to adjust the look of this. So for example, the clarity of the water, if we turn this down, you see that it gets kind of murky. And you bring it up, it gets clear. Okay, you can bring this up to like a really high number, but you can only bring it down to 0. At 0, it's like completely murky. So I think by default setting is 1. But what we can do is if you want to just have like nuclear waste or something flowing down a river, okay, you can bring the clarity down. And then, so in case you don't know, scattering is like this, I don't know how to describe it. It's like basically the murkiness of it, okay? If we bring the scattering and bring that, whoops, all the way down to black, what we're left with is now just a bunch of absorption, which is the color of the water, okay? So the water can still be pretty clear, but just have a color. So what we're going to do is take the absorption, we can click on this, and I made that really, really dark. Let's cancel that. If I change the color of this, you'll see I'm changing the color of the water. That's the absorption. Okay, effectively just changing the color of the water. So if you want it to be like a more natural type of river, it's probably going to be a little bit brown. If you want it to look more pure or something, you can go to like a blue. And then you can bring the clarity back up, and you can fine tune these things. But the scattering is what gives it that milky, murky look. And this also has a color tint to it. So you can go, if you're going for like a nuclear waste, make that kind of green maybe and bring this down. And you can adjust these settings to be whatever you want. But like this kind of illustrates for you how the scattering, absorption, and clarity settings work. Okay. So if you want a really clean, pure river, you'll probably keep this fairly clear and then change these settings back to a more neutral color, and you should be pretty close to what you want. All right, so now that we know the basics of how to adjust the color and the scattering for the water, we're going to look more at actually changing the detail and the foam in the water, which is what gives it the motion look. But to do that, first, we're going to do a couple of things, and I'm going to show you really quick why we need to do these couple things, or at least why I did. If you see here, we have foam going around, okay? That can be really nice. Sometimes you don't want so much foam. And if you go down to the foam settings, there's basically, at its core, two things that affect how the foam shows up. There's the color of it, and then there's the normal. And you can see here, foam normal, blend and scale, and then foam color, detail, and alpha. So if you set, for example, the foam color detail to 0, okay, you basically lose all the color, okay? But you still get the normal, so like the detail, what looks like actual detail in the mesh right here. So if I turn the foam normal blend to 0, then you're left with basically no shape of the foam. Okay, so let's set this back to 2, and I'm going to show you something really quick to help illustrate this even more. I'm going to set this back to 0.5, which is where it was. If I go back to this little widget and make the water not very clear, okay? I want to have a kind of a background to this so you can see it. Come on, there we go. All right, and I go back to here, change the foam color detail, so all this white stuff here, to 0. All right, and then I change the normal to 0. And you look at this, and you see you still have the shape of something, kind of a shadow going across the water. It's not like you actually completely lose the foam. You still have something there, even though the parameters that should adjust it, there's also roughness and specular, but like it's annoying having to adjust all these things and maybe get rid of all of it. However, I will say there is a checkbox down here called Use Foam. If you turn that off, it goes away completely. But maybe you want it to stay looking white and just not be as strong. So let's go back right here, turn foam back on. We're going to turn these things back to where they were. So 0.5, not 2. So this is how it was before. I went in to the master material, the parent material right here for the Flux surface over. And in here, if you look at this, there's a bunch of different material functions. But if you go to the one that says MF fluid foam, there was a pin here. This stuff wasn't here. There's a pin for intensity, for a scalar parameter, and it was empty. And so I just made one called, did I spell that right? Foam intensity. And then just connected it there, set the default to 1, and then saved it. And so now when I go into here and I search for intensity, I have an intensity slider. So I can take this and turn it down, whoops, to 0. And now if I just go into the normal, scroll all the way down to the foam, normal, now it's like not having foam on at all, even though it technically is still on. So it's one way that I found to kind of control the intensity overall without having to fine tune all these different things. So if that's helpful for you, you can try doing that. Otherwise, just leave it alone. The reason I went through all the trouble of mentioning that to you is because we have the detail wave right now turned off, and the foam itself is adding this detail to it, okay? So if you're trying to fine tune the look of things and the speed and you're like, what is going on? That could be part of the reason, is because the foam itself is adding or subtracting from the way it looks. So with that in mind and knowing how you can modify it, let's turn detail wave back on. And we're going to actually turn the foam back off just so we can see this better. I apologize for all the jumping around. Okay, so this is no foam, and we're actually going to make this not so cloudy anymore because we don't need that little backing or whatever. Okay, that's great. All right, let's go all the way back up to the top. Okay, detail wave height. These things are all named according to what they control. Detail wave height, detail wave length. You go down, wave detail, whatever, all these different things. It'll make, hopefully the naming convention will make sense soon. But detail wave height, for example, if you look at these little tiny ripples, okay, the size of them basically is controlled by the detail wave length, okay? You see how those are getting wider or shorter. They're tiny little ripples now. That's the length, okay? This I think was at like 800. The height is the height of them. You see how those are getting taller? So this, of course, can give you really weird and exaggerated results if you go too high. I had this at 18, okay? So that seems to be a fairly natural amount for me. You can make this lower and super calm. You can bring it down to practically nothing if you just want the tiniest little ripples. If you look at nature, most of the time, basically all the time, a really deep body of water will have almost no ripples. It's only when it's really shallow and the water is coming over a bunch of little rocks or branches or something like that, that it'll have larger, more noticeable ripples. So keeping this at something like 15 or 18, depending on what's supposed to be below the surface, would look more natural. So that's detail wave and length. Detail wave range is the other one in here. Most of these things, I feel like the other ones in here I didn't really change. We might talk about wave detail fast foam in a second. We're going to talk about detail wave range. Now this is a number of units away from your viewing position. Okay, this caused me a little bit of a hiccup in a render because if I bring this down, so if we go up a little bit, you can see that apparently the detail wave kind of goes throughout the whole scene here. If I bring this number down, you'll see eventually, you see how the detail wave is coming closer, and now the detail wave isn't doing anything because it's too close. And we extend this and it goes further away. This is based, again, so the default I think is like 25,000. This is based on where you are viewing from. So the reason this became kind of an issue, and let me pilot this camera here. So this is my cine camera in the scene. If I back up, okay, if I came and got a shot from way back here, and I decided to zoom in a whole bunch, okay, I'm gonna point my camera here. Let's focus right over there. Okay, and I take my detail wave range and I shorten it up. If I'm getting closer shots earlier and I just kind of duplicate the camera and keep moving to something else, and maybe my value of like 8,000 was good for before, but because it's based on where I am, now that value doesn't work because I'm too far away for the detail wave range to actually be covering what I'm seeing. So I need to now make an adjustment and extend this out. I feel like there's kind of no reason to not just keep this out there, like just make it a big number so it covers everything. And that's what I ended up doing. So just be aware of that. This thing is based on where you're viewing from. So if you have a really long focal length on your camera, you may be cutting it off, and you may not notice it in your screen, especially if your editor viewport is going really slowly because of all the foliage or something that's in your scene and you can't tell, like things aren't updating fast enough to tell that there's no detail there. Just want you to be aware that could be happening. For this, we are going to turn back on the foam. Wave detail fast foam. Do you see as I slide this back and forth? The default for this is 1. So right in here, as water will go, like there's the main foam, which is from all the current and stuff, but then water can creep along in these back areas and you can barely see if there is any foam. If you take wave detail fast foam and you increase this, you'll start to see foam coming out of those little nooks and crannies. And that can be useful to just add more detail in different places where they might be a little bit of turbulence that's causing foam or whatever. So just be aware, not all of like the foam specific settings are in the foam section. This one's in the detail area. And I think the idea is because this is being added from this detail element and not from the foam specific element. So there's that. All right, let's move on to the fluid color section. This is a section that I spent hours tinkering with and didn't see any changes, and it was driving me absolutely bonkers. And then I realized that this other thing over here existed for adjusting the color and the scattering and absorption. So I don't know what these are supposed to do. Maybe they're possibly overrides for things. They didn't seem to do anything when I was messing with them. So the majority of these things, I feel like you don't have to touch. The one thing that I would say is worth looking at is the foam scattering scale. Now, if we go, there's just so much foam here. If I take the foam scattering scale, which by default is 2, and I drag this up, you'll see the water starting to get murky, and it looks like scattering. And it kind of has the same effect, but I think it's supposed to be mimicking if there's a lot of foam being kicked up and it's causing scattering in the water. I think that's what it's supposed to do. Okay? This right here goes up and it gets really murky, bring it down, and it gets clear again. Okay? I don't know if anything happens when you go negative, but that's what happens with this. So it's another interesting way potentially to adjust it and make it look more murky. What's interesting is if you scroll down to the foam section, and there's the foam color base. And as I adjust this, we'll talk about this a little bit more later. As I adjust this, you adjust the color of the foam itself from white to blue or green or whatever. But you'll notice it's not adjusting that scattering, the foam scattering setting. I'm going to reset this. But this foam scattering scale isn't affected by that. So I actually played around a lot and I couldn't figure out a way to adjust this. Other than if I go in here and adjust the scattering color, it's adjusted by that. So I don't know why there's a separate setting for foam scattering scale, but there is. Okay, I think we should move on to the next section. Again, most of the stuff I haven't had to use or adjust. So Flux data, I haven't had to adjust. Interaction, I'm not making games. I think this is mostly for like a character going in. Flux Painter, this is like for if you want to add certain sections of certain color. It's really helpful if you like are making a game or something, or maybe even a cinematic where you want there to be an ocean and then maybe there's an oil spill or a shark attack happened and there's like red water there, you can use this, I believe, to add those elements in there. But we're going to look at flux state because there are 3 settings in here that I have used to adjust how it looks. All right, we're going to start off with the state distance depth max. Now, this is one that I came across and I ended up not having to use it, but it seems like it could be interesting. If I drag this slider, negative, it starts at 0, and I go down, you'll see that it kind of just like lowers the level of the water. And there's issues with it because you still end up with like the wet decal or whatever, and then the caustic staying where they are. It's just the surface that changes. But it's kind of interesting, and you might be able to go into the other elements and bring those down as well and just kind of, I don't know, fine-tune the depth of your water. Like here you can see that there's issues with the under material, but the over material is gone. So it's possible you could work with all 3 of those, or all those different materials, and bring them all down or up to kind of fine-tune how it goes. But I've always just kept this at 0. I just wanted to point it out. Now this next one, the state velocity scale, is probably the main setting that you'll use to adjust how the water looks, because this appears to just globally change the speed of the water. So it just starts off at 1, and if I drag this down, you'll see the water slowing down. You can actually go negative. You can have the water flow backwards. You could probably even keyframe this so that the water goes whoop, and kind of reverses direction in the middle of a shot or something. And so you can fine tune how fast the water flows, and this controls the water and the foam. It's just kind of everything. All right. So one thing to keep in mind though is if you reduce this too much or increase it too much, you end up making water that just looks unnaturally slow or unnaturally fast. If I bring this up past 1, it's like, why is this going so fast? That doesn't make any sense. So I believe it just starts at 1, and I probably brought it down to like, I don't know, 0.6 or 0.7 to make it a little bit calmer. But that's a very useful parameter to know. And then the last thing in the flux state section, this is one that I haven't changed, but it could be interesting if you can figure out how it works. The state divergence settings, and there's several of them here. I actually don't know what this does, but when I try playing with it, it seems to have an effect similar to the detail section above. So if I bring this up, it doesn't seem to do anything, but if I go down to the negatives, you get these big bubbling whatever. It's like a noise pattern thing. I don't know what this is supposed to do, but there's lots of different settings that control this. So it could be that this will help you get more detail or just more realistic action of the water flowing. But I don't actually know what it does. But I just want to point out that it does something similar to the detail wave section above. All right, now moving on to the main section that I was playing with and trying to figure out is the foam section. I haven't messed with the flux wave texture, haven't messed with the flux surface layer. I know that there is a way to blend like a river with a coastline domain or an ocean domain. I haven't really needed to do that, so I don't know much about that yet. But we're going to go down and talk about the foam. So, starting from the top. All right, looking at the foam color detail slider. This, by default, I think is at actually 0.5. But I treat it basically kind of like an opacity or a blur slider, where if I bring this down, it seems to almost like flatten it out, like it's blurring it out. It's just making it less clear. There's a few settings in here that seem to kind of do the same thing, but this one I treat almost like an opacity thing, like how much of the detail do I want to see in the foam. The foam color alpha slider is kind of an intensity or contrast slider for this parameter right here. So if I change the color of this to red, and then I increase this, eventually it'll like kind of get so contrasty that it's black, but you can adjust kind of how this looks using the alpha slider. I don't fully understand what it's adjusting and stuff, but these two work together. These three work together. Detail, alpha, and base, but especially alpha and base. Okay. By default, this is set to 0, and this is set to like a white color. Moving down to the foam normal blend, this controls, I think I showed this earlier, kind of how much of the shape of the foam there is. So if I set this to 0, you get the color of the foam, but no detail, if that makes sense. So I bring this back up and you get more of the shape, the apparent shape of the foam. And then you bring it down, you get none of that. The foam roughness and foam specular do what you would expect. If you increase the roughness, it's less shiny. You bring the roughness down, it's more shiny. Same with specular. You know, they do what specular and roughness would be expected to do. I don't remember if these were at 2. See how I set these back to default and they didn't go to what they were before? I think these were at 0.2. I think that looks correct. All right, moving down to the foam UV scale. This basically changes kind of the apparent size of the bubbles, I guess. If you drag this, you'll see pretty quickly it changing how the foam looks. And what's interesting is if you bring this up to a fairly high number, you almost get like this tiny bubble look, although it's obviously like a repeated pattern. But this basically just changes the size, like the UV scale of the foam. Okay, and you can go negative with it, but it's an extremely small number. I believe the default is 0.0015, and this is what it starts out as. So if you wanted to make it, you know, a little bit smaller, you could go 0.0020. Or am I going the wrong way? 0.005. Yeah, it's getting a little bit smaller. So that's the default. That's how you adjust the size of the foam waves. All right, the next setting I want to show you is under the foam section, called foam dithering. This is kind of interesting. It can be subtle at times, but it basically, if I go in here close to the rock, you can see that there's a pretty solid line where the water meets the rock. But if I turn on foam dithering, you get kind of this blending effect. You have some settings up here for that. Foam dithering scale, offset, and alpha. And if I go like this and adjust some things, you get basically like a feathering effect where you can make that line be reduced. So if you don't have anything there, it kind of is obvious that the water is just kind of intersecting the object. But if you bring that up a bit, you can kind of feather how that appears. So it's nice to have an option for softening that connection point between the water and your meshes. All right, the next setting we're going to look at is actually, it appears to be similar to the dithering settings, but it's the foam hardness width. By default, it's 0.35 in this preset. But if I drag this down and start to go negative, you notice, if you look in here especially, you can see it kind of does a similar feathering effect where it kind of keeps the foam from spreading as much, and it reduces it away from objects, away from the shore. And that only seems to really happen if I go negative with it. So just another way to kind of reduce how much foam is appearing in your scene. And again, default is 0.35. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is the foam soft settings. These are another set of settings that I don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, but I apologize for making a tutorial about a bunch of settings I don't understand. I just want to show you what this seems to do. The foam soft base, the default is 0.3. If I crank this up, you'll see what appears to be kind of a scattering effect happen in here. Okay, how it got lighter. Let's see, foam soft base, there we go. Bring that down, and you see how it gets a little bit more murky. To me, it almost seems like it's doing a blur effect where it's kind of feathering out the foam into, like it's spreading out on the edges a little bit. You can also increase the intensity of this. You see it gets a little bit stronger, something gets stronger. And I don't know exactly what that's supposed to be mimicking, but it does add what seems like a little bit of detail to the water. And then the last settings here that we're going to be looking at is there's separate velocity settings for the foam, separate from the water in general. So right here, foam UV scale, UV speed, and then foam UV velocity. The scale we've already talked about, the UV speed. Let's do this. This might make it easier to see. If we take our overall velocity, well, maybe we do need it running. I was going to set this to 0. But you can see that the foam is still moving. Okay. If I go down to my foam, the foam UV speed, and crank this up, you'll see that that starts moving a lot faster. So it's like how it's shifting along in here. I think that was 0.8. Foam UV velocity, if I was to crank this up, see it's not doing anything right now because the state in general is not moving. So if I bring this back up to like 0.7, and then I go down to the foam UV velocity and I crank this up, you'll see the foam starts moving super fast, or I can make this go super slow. But you see all the detail, like the simulation state is moving fast still, but the foam is not. So that's what this does. If you, for some reason, want the foam to be moving differently than the rest of the simulation, you can control that. All right, if you made it this far, congratulations. Hopefully you understand a little bit better how to use the material and all of these parameters to adjust it, to fine-tune your river or coastline domain or ocean to how you want it to look. I don't know if all the settings are shared between all the different things, but I know that there are some similarities. So hopefully this helped you understand a little bit more of how to use Fluid Flux. I've really enjoyed using it, so I'm excited to see what all of you create in the future as well. Have fun.